I've got a book of short stories by Salman Rushdie. I enjoyed this book of short stories by Salman Rushdie. It's called East West, and it's a set of 9 stories, 3 set in the East, 3 set in the West, and 3 where East and West collide in some form or some manner. There is a small problem with this book, and it kind of highlights one of the problems with collections of short stories. There are many problems with collections of short stories, and I know only too well because of all the books that I've written, several of those books being collections of short stories. They don't sell very well because it's difficult for people to really get invested in a collection of short stories. A novel introduces a set of characters. You become attached to the characters. You see their lives, you see the story progress from start to finish or middle to start to finish. Oh, postmodern, everything's out of order, but it's one story with a set of characters. Short stories, though, might only last a few pages. You have to get to know a character and then say farewell to that character all in the space of those few pages, and it can be exhausting. So I think, that's probably one of the problems I've got, plus the fact that I'm an unknown writer. It's unlikely people are going to be picking up, I've got one here, Sarah the Writer and other stories. They're all set in Poland, but that doesn't help you really kind of grow too attached to any of the people at the heart of the stories. I should focus on novels, maybe other people should too. Having said that, there are some good stories here. The second problem with a collection of short stories, though, especially if you have this title that doesn't just say the name of one story and other stories like this. Sarah the Writer is the central story in that collection, so I called it Sarah the Writer and Other Stories. This is just called East West, so unless you actually look inside and read the bit of the blurb, you wouldn't know that it was a collection of short stories. So what about that theme then? Is it an effective theme? The East, the West, the East meets West? Well, in the acknowledgements at the end of the book, Rushdie tells us that of the 9 stories, 6 of them were previously published. If they were previously published, it suggests that he didn't write them with this book in mind. He wrote them to get each one published, which is fair enough. But it does mean that to get them into a collection like this, there's a certain amount of shoehorning. So if we look at the stories set in the East, they all make sense within the East. They tell little stories about the East. One of them in particular I really liked, and that was the prophet's hair. It's kind of got a nice little sting in the tail, and it didn't really go where I expected it to go. So that was really good. But then when you go to the West, suddenly we're into more academic creative territory. And I say academic creative because on the academic side you need to know a lot to appreciate the story, and on the creative side it's like, hey, here's my chance to show my flair for language, my creativity, which is fine. Sometimes that's okay. But these were the hardest to read. So there's one called Yorick, which is all about Hamlet. Another one, it didn't really work for me, which was kind of almost sci-fi in a way. It was weird. It was At the Auction of the Ruby Slippers. This one was the least like anything else in the book because, it's West, but it's not real West. It's kind of satire of the West. And then the last one, Christopher Columbus and Queen Isabella of Spain consummate their relationship, Santa Fe AD 1492. It was okay, but I don't really feel that it needed to be here. In fact, the 3 stories for West don't really need to be here. Could have just concentrated on the 6 stories of either East or East meets West. And the ironic thing is that the first story in East, called Good Advice is Rarer Than Rubies, is about a girl in the East who has an arranged marriage with somebody in the West, in Bradford, and between you and me, obviously wants to get out of it. So, how is that not East-West? Just because she doesn't go to Bradford in the story doesn't mean Bradford ceases to exist. It is still East-West. So, like I say, a fair amount of shoehorning in of ideas to fit the overall conceit. And I kind of felt that a little bit as well with Chekhov and Zulu, which was an okay story, but a little bit weak. It's like, hey, you know, what if these two people were absolutely obsessed with Star Trek? Yeah, okay, not terrible. The Harmony of the Spheres was a good story, again, one with a sting in the tail. And The Quarter, the last story here, kind of had shades of V.S. Naipaul a little bit. It felt very kind of personal. It felt kind of like, hey, here I am, this is the immigrant experience, but it's also the experience of growing up, and that's universal. So, like I say then, if you can forgive the shoehorning in, if you can forgive the fact that you only get to spend a few pages with these characters, it's a nice collection, and I would say that it's fairly typical of Rushdie's work, certainly of the work that I read of his. I enjoyed it. I would recommend it, but I can think of other books that you might want to concentrate on instead of this one. So, for now, thank you very much. Good reading.